everyone, and welcome to this deep dive into the life of Huey P. Newton.
Huey P. Newton.
Yeah, so you probably know him as a co-founder of the Black Panther Party.
Right.
Like, I mean, that image of him in the beret,
Yeah.
it's hard to forget.
Very striking.
But we're going to go beyond the headlines today.
Okay.
We're going to take a closer look at the man behind the symbol.
That's right. We're going deep into the source material that you provided.
Yes.
Which are excerpts from Newton's Wikipedia entry.
That's right.
Now, Wikipedia can be a great starting point.
Yeah.
It offers kind of a broad overview, but also some really intriguing details.
Exactly. And that's our mission today, to go beyond that surface level understanding of Newton. You know, we're going to explore his intellectual side, his impact on the community, and yes, we'll discuss the controversies that surrounded him.
It's going to be a fascinating journey uncovering the complexities of a man who was both brilliant and flawed, a revolutionary and a scholar.
Totally. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Huey P. Newton was born in 1942 in Monroe, Louisiana, named after the state's populous governor, Huey Long.
Huey Long, okay.
But his family story very quickly becomes part of a much larger narrative like the Great Migration.
The Great Migration.
His family fled racial violence in Washita Parish.
That's right.
The Equal Justice Initiative has documented 37 lynchings.
Wow.
In that parish alone between 1877 and 1950.
That's grim.
That is the fifth highest of any county in the entire South.
It really puts things in perspective.
Yeah, so the Newton family, they head west
Uh-huh.
to Oakland, California, hoping for a better life, but they face poverty and hardship there as well.
Yeah, and within that context, young Huey begins to grapple with his own identity, his place in the world.
Right.
He even wrote about feeling ashamed of being Black due to the way Black history and culture were presented, or rather completely absent in the educational system.
It's a feeling that so many Black students sadly could relate to then and even now. But here's where it gets interesting, and this detail always blows me away. Newton taught himself to read using Plato's Republic.
Plato's Republic.
Yeah.
That's incredible. It speaks volumes about his intellectual curiosity and his drive. I mean, this wasn't just some kid trying to get by.
Right.
This was a kid who was actively seeking knowledge, who was engaging with these complex philosophical ideas from a young age.
And it really challenges that stereotypical image, doesn't
Absolutely.
it? Of like a, street thug.
Yeah.
And this is just the beginning. This is a man who eventually earns a PhD in social philosophy.
Right.
How often do you hear that mentioned when people talk about Huey Newton?
Not often enough. It changes the whole frame of reference.
Absolutely.
And it's important to note that his dissertation wasn't some abstract philosophical treatise either.
Yeah.
It was titled War Against the Panthers, a study of repression in America.
Wow.
So he was directly analyzing the forces that he saw working against the Black community, the forces he was actively fighting against in his own life.
So we see this connection, right, between his intellectual pursuits and his activism.
Yeah.
It's not just theory for him.
No.
It's about understanding the world in order to change it.
Exactly. And that brings us to a pivotal point in his life, meeting Bobby Seale at Merritt College
Okay.
and the founding of the Black Panther Party.
So before we dive into the Black Panthers, I'm curious about this period at Merritt College. What was Newton like as a student?
Yeah.
Was he already actively involved in politics?
He was definitely making waves. He was instrumental in getting the first Black history course
Wow.
added to the curriculum at Merritt.
Wow.
Imagine that at college in the 1960s with no Black history course until students like Newton fought for it.
That's a significant achievement,
It is.
especially considering the time period. It shows that he wasn't just about protesting.
Right.
He was also about education.
Empowering his community with knowledge.
Totally.
Absolutely. And this is a key point to remember as we kind of delve into the Black Panther Party.
Okay.
They weren't just about armed self-defense, although that image certainly grabbed headlines.
Right.
They were also deeply involved in community organizing, social programs, and political education.
Okay, so let's talk about the Black Panthers then. I know they're most famous for their 10-point program,
The 10-point program.
which went far beyond just self-defense.
Yes.
What were some of the key demands that they put forward?
They demanded decent housing, full employment, and end to police brutality.
Yeah.
Education that taught true Black history. These are demands that resonate deeply today,
Right.
especially in the context of ongoing struggles for racial justice.
It's striking how relevant their demands still feel over 50 years later. They were really trying to address these systemic issues,
Yes.
not just these surface level problems.
And, when you really dig into Newton's writings and speeches, you see this thread of revolutionary humanism running through them.
Revolutionary humanism. Okay, I'll admit I haven't heard that term before.
Okay, good.
Can you unpack that a little bit? What did Newton mean by that?
So it's fascinating, really. He was deeply influenced by Malcolm X.
Okay.
But he felt that religion wasn't the answer, at least not in the traditional sense.
Okay.
He believed that true liberation came from recognizing our shared humanity, our interconnectedness as human beings, and then fighting for a society that reflected those values.
So it's about transcending traditional boundaries, whether it's race or religion or nationality, and focusing on our common humanity as the basis for building this just an equitable world.
Exactly.
Okay.
And he believed that this fight required a revolutionary spirit, a willingness to challenge the status quo and dismantle these oppressive systems.
Right.
But it also had to be rooted in a deep respect for human dignity and potential.
So it's not just about tearing things down.
Right.
It's about building something new, something better based on this idea of revolutionary humanism.
Exactly.
This is a complex concept, but I'm really starting to see how it shaped his approach to activism and community organizing.
It's a key to understanding him, for sure. And you see it in action in some of the Black Panther Party's most famous initiatives.
You're talking about the community programs, right? Like the Free Breakfast for Children program.
With free breakfast for children.
I remember learning about that in school.
Yeah.
It was a huge deal, feeding thousands of kids every day.
It was incredibly impactful.
Yeah, and then there was the Oakland Community School, which provided this high-quality education to 150 children.
That's right.
From underprivileged neighborhoods. Even the county supervisor at the time praised Newton
That's amazing.
for his dedication to the school.
So you have this image of the Black Panthers as these militant revolutionaries.
Right.
But on the other hand, they're running these incredibly positive community programs that are directly helping people.
Right.
It's a stark contrast to the way they were often portrayed in the media.
And I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier about Newton's strategic thinking.
Yes.
He understood that lasting change required more than just protests and confrontations. It also required building these alternative institutions, empowering communities, and creating this vision of a better future that people could believe in.
He was working on multiple fronts, trying to address immediate needs while also pushing for a more radical transformation of society.
Right. It's a really complex and nuanced approach, and I think it often gets lost in the simplified narratives that we often hear about the Black Panthers. And it's important to remember that Newton was trying to channel what he saw as the energy and frustration of young Black people into something constructive, something political.
Right.
He writes about this in his autobiography, Revolutionary Suicide.
Revolutionary Suicide.
There's this quote that I found that really stuck with me. He says, "I tried to transform many of the so-called criminal activities going on in the street into something political, although this had to be done gradually." It shows how he was trying to bridge that gap between the streets and the movement.
Yeah, he recognized that change doesn't happen overnight. It requires patient strategy and a deep understanding of the complexities of the situation.
It makes you wonder how he managed to balance all of these different aspects of his life. The intellectual side, the community organizing, the revolutionary politics.
It must have been incredibly demanding.
Yeah, and as we move forward in this deep dive, we'll see how those demands, those tensions began to take a toll on him, both personally and politically.
Okay.
Right, because we can't shy away from the more difficult parts of his story. And that brings us to a turning point in Newton's life, the 1967 shooting of Oakland police officer John Frey.
That's right. It's a complicated incident that cast a long shadow over his life and the Black Panther Party, and we'll dive into the details and the implications of that event in our next segment.
Looking forward to it.
Yeah. Welcome back. We left off talking about the shooting of Officer John Frey.
Right.
A pivotal event in Huey Newton's life, and one that really polarized public opinion about him and the Black Panther Party.
Yeah, it seems like everything changed after that incident. But before we delve into the aftermath, can we rewind a bit and talk about the shooting itself? Like, what do the sources actually tell us about what happened that night?
It's a complicated story, and like with many events from that era, there are conflicting accounts.
Right.
What we do know is that in the early hours of October 28th, 1967, Newton was pulled over by Officer Frey for a traffic violation. Things escalated quickly.
Okay.
And a shootout ensued, leaving both Newton and Frey wounded, and another officer, Herbert Haynes, injured as well.
And Officer Frey tragically died from his injuries.
Yeah.
So what happened next? Was there a trial?
Yes. Newton was arrested and charged with murder.
Wow.
The trial was highly publicized.
Yeah.
And became a focal point for racial tensions in the country. He was eventually convicted of voluntary manslaughter, a lesser charge.
Okay.
But the conviction was later overturned on a technicality.
That's a huge legal victory, but I imagine the whole ordeal must have taken a toll on him.
Absolutely. And it's during this period that we see the rise of the Free Huey campaign, which became a global movement.
Yeah.
Thousands of people rallied for his release, turning him into a symbol of Black resistance.
I remember seeing those images, the posters, the demonstrations, the slogans. It was such a powerful movement. It really captured the attention of the world.
Yeah, it spoke to the broader issues of racial injustice and police brutality.
Right.
They were at the heart of the Black Power movement.
Totally.
And in a way, Newton's imprisonment became a rallying point.
Yeah.
A symbol of the systemic oppression that Black people were facing.
It's interesting how individuals can become these larger-than-life figures, almost embodying a cause.
Right.
Do you think that weighed on Newton, that sense of being a symbol, like a spokesperson for a whole movement?
I think it must have been a heavy burden to carry.
Yeah.
And as we'll see, the pressure only intensified after his release from prison. The post-prison years are marked by a series of triumphs and tragedies.
Oh, wow.
A real roller coaster ride.
So let's talk about that period. What happens after Newton is released? Does he jump right back into leading the Black Panther Party?
He tries to, but things had shifted. The party was facing internal conflicts, government surveillance, increasing pressure from law enforcement, and Newton himself was grappling with his own personal demons.
You're talking about the accusations of drug use, paranoia, and violence that started to surface during that time?
Exactly. There were multiple allegations against him,
Yeah.
including the 1974 shooting of Kathleen Smith, a 17-year-old in Oakland.
That's a difficult topic to discuss, but it's important to address.
Right.
What do the sources tell us about this incident?
Well, the sources paint a complicated picture. According to reports, Smith was a sex worker.
Okay.
And there was an altercation with Newton that ended with her being fatally shot.
Yeah.
There were witnesses,
Right.
but the case was ultimately dismissed after 2 trials resulted in hung juries.
So there was never a definitive resolution to the case?
No, and that's part of what makes it so difficult to unpack. It's a tragic situation all around.
Yeah.
A young woman lost her life, and the circumstances surrounding her death remain shrouded in uncertainty.
Right. And this wasn't the only accusation against Newton during this period, right?
Right.
There was also the alleged assault on his tailor.
Yes. In 1974, he was accused of pistol whipping his tailor in a dispute over payment. He was arrested and released on bail, but this incident, along with the pending charges in the Smith case, led him to flee to Cuba with his girlfriend Gwen Fontaine.
So he goes into exile.
Right.
That must have been a difficult decision to leave the country, to leave the movement that he had built.
It was a turning point, for sure. And I think it speaks to the pressure he was under, both from the legal system and from within the Black Panther Party itself.
Yeah.
There were growing concerns about his leadership,
Right.
his stability, and his ability to effectively guide the movement.
It sounds like things were falling apart around him.
Yeah.
What happened to the Black Panther Party during this time?
With Newton in exile, Elaine Brown stepped into the leadership role.
Okay.
She brought a new perspective and focus to the party,
Okay.
emphasizing community organizing and political education. But the party continued to face challenges both internal and external.
So Newton is in Cuba, the Black Panther Party is struggling, and back in the U.S. there are these unresolved legal issues hanging over his head.
Yeah.
What happens next? Does he stay in Cuba indefinitely?
He remains in Cuba for several years.
Okay.
But in 1977, he makes a surprising decision
Okay.
to return to the U.S. to face trial for both the Smith murder and the assault on his tailor.
Wow. That's a bold move. He could have stayed in Cuba, avoided the whole ordeal. Why do you think he came back?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think it speaks to his belief in his own innocence
Okay.
and his desire to clear his name. He may have also felt a sense of responsibility to the Black Panther Party and the movement as a whole, a need to step back into the fray.
So he walks right back into the lion's den. What was the outcome of those trials?
The Smith case, as we mentioned, ended with the charges being dropped
Okay.
after the key witness refused to testify. And in the assault case, the tailor himself changed his testimony multiple times, ultimately stating that he couldn't identify his attacker. This led to Newton's acquittal on the assault charge.
Wow. So he's cleared of both charges, but the shadow of these accusations lingered, didn't it?
Yeah.
And there's this other disturbing incident that surfaces later, the alleged attempt to assassinate Crystal Gray, the key witness in the Smith case.
Yeah, that's a chilling story, according to the sources. 3 Black Panthers attempted to kill Gray, but they mistakenly targeted the wrong house and ended up in a shootout with the occupant.
Oh, wow.
One of the Panthers, Lewis Johnson, was killed and the other two fled.
And one of the surviving assailants, Flores Forbes, ended up being shot and paralyzed in the Nevada desert.
Wow.
He claimed that he and his accomplice were supposed to be killed to eliminate any witnesses to the attempt on Gray's life.
It's a disturbing episode. And while Newton denied any involvement, it further fueled suspicions.
Right.
And added to the growing narrative of him being a dangerous and unpredictable figure.
It's a lot to process. You know, these violent incidents, the accusations, the exile, the trials. It's a far cry from the hopeful vision of revolutionary humanism that we talked about earlier.
It is, and I think it raises some difficult questions about the nature of revolution.
Yeah.
The complexities of power and the personal toll that these struggles can take on individuals.
And we also can't ignore the 2007 accusation from former Black Panther Erica Huggins,
Right.
who alleges that Newton repeatedly raped her and threatened her children if she spoke out.
This is a deeply disturbing accusation, and it adds yet another layer of complexity to our understanding of Newton.
Right.
It's important to acknowledge this accusation.
Yeah.
But we also have to recognize that it came decades after the alleged events, and Newton was never charged or tried for these crimes. We can't adjudicate this here, but it's a part of the historical record that can't be ignored.
It's all so heavy, so tragic. It makes you wonder, was this downward spiral inevitable?
Yeah.
Was there something in Newton's personality, his experiences, that made this trajectory unavoidable?
That's a tough question, and I don't think there's an easy answer.
Right.
He was a product of his time, shaped by the violence and oppression he was fighting against.
Yeah.
But he was also an individual who made choices, some of which had devastating consequences.
It's a reminder that even those who fight for justice are human.
Yes.
Capable of both great good and terrible harm. Their stories are rarely simple, and our understanding of them needs to reflect that complexity.
Absolutely. And I think it's also a reminder of the importance of listening to and believing survivors, even as we grapple with Newton's legacy.
Right.
We can't dismiss or minimize the pain of those who accused him of violence and abuse.
So where do we go from here? How do we make sense of this complicated, often contradictory figure?
Yeah.
A man who earned a PhD, founded a movement, inspired millions, but also left this trail of pain and destruction in his wake.
That's the challenge, isn't it? We can't erase the good he did,
Right.
nor can we ignore the harm he caused.
And then there's his death in 1989, shot dead on an Oakland street.
Right.
The killer, Tyrone Robinson, claimed his motive was to advance in a prison gang. It's such a tragic, senseless end to his story. A man who dedicated his life to fighting against violence becomes a victim of the very forces he tried to combat.
It's a heartbreaking irony, and it underscores the complexities of his legacy. Was he a revolutionary who ultimately succumbed to the forces he was fighting against?
Right.
Or was he a flawed individual whose personal demons overshadowed his achievements?
These are questions that historians and scholars continue to debate, and ultimately it's up to each individual to engage with the evidence, grapple with the contradictions, and come to their own conclusions about Huey P. Newton's place in history.
What's crucial is that we don't shy away from those difficult conversations. We need to explore the nuances, challenge our own assumptions, and resist the urge to simplify or sanitize the past.
Absolutely, because history isn't about black and white figures. It's about real people with all their complexities and contradictions.
Right.
And it's by understanding those complexities that we can learn from the past and build a more just and equitable future.
Well said. And in the spirit of continuing to explore these complexities, I think it would be fascinating to shift gears a bit and delve into Newton's intellectual side.
Okay.
You know, we touched on it earlier.
Yeah.
But there's so much more to uncover.
I'm really intrigued by that aspect of his life. The scholar, the philosopher, we know he earned a PhD. We've talked about revolutionary humanism.
Right.
But I'm curious to learn more about his writings, his ideas, and how they evolved over time.
Let's do it in our final segment. We'll dive deep into Newton's intellectual world, exploring his academic work, his essays, and his book, Revolutionary Suicide.
So we've explored the activism, the controversies, the very public life and struggles of Huey P. Newton. But you mentioned something earlier that really caught my attention, his intellectual side.
Yeah.
He wasn't just a man of action. He was a deep thinker, a scholar. And I think this is where we can truly separate the man from the myth.
It's a side of him that often gets overshadowed. Unfortunately, people tend to fixate on the image of the revolutionary, the militant figure, but Newton was so much more than that.
Right.
He was a voracious reader, a student of philosophy, and someone who deeply engaged with complex ideas.
You mentioned that he actually earned a PhD, which in itself is an incredible accomplishment, but to do that while also leading a movement facing legal battles,
Right.
dealing with all the chaos that surrounded him,
Yeah.
it's mind-boggling.
It speaks to his intellectual capacity and drive.
Yeah.
And his dissertation wasn't just some dry academic exercise either. It was titled War Against the Panthers, a study of repression in America.
Wow.
So he was using his academic work to analyze the very forces that he saw working against the Black community forces he was actively fighting against in his own life.
That's a powerful statement.
It is.
He wasn't content to just be an activist. He wanted to understand the underlying structures of power, the historical forces that shaped the Black experience in America, and that's what led him to pursue a PhD.
He was seeking knowledge as a tool for liberation, and it wasn't confined to his academic work. Newton was also a prolific writer. He authored essays, articles, and even a book, Revolutionary Suicide, which is part autobiography, part philosophical treatise.
I've always been struck by that title, Revolutionary Suicide. It seems to suggest a certain fatalism, a recognition that radical change often comes at a great personal cost.
It's a provocative title, for sure, and I think it reflects Newton's evolving worldview. He grappled with the contradictions of revolution, the violence inherent in the struggle for liberation, and the toll it took on individuals and communities.
In his book, there's a quote that has always resonated with me. He says, "I tried to transform many of the so-called criminal activities going on the street into something political, although this had to be done gradually." It speaks to his strategic thinking, his understanding that lasting change requires more than just anger and passion.
Right.
It requires a plan, a long-term vision.
He wasn't naive about the challenges. He recognized that change wouldn't happen overnight and that it would require a multifaceted approach he had to navigate the complexities of street life, the realities of power, and the need to build a movement that could sustain itself over time.
But he wasn't working in a vacuum. His ideas were shaped by the writings of Malcolm X, Frantz Fanon, other revolutionary thinkers. He was part of a larger intellectual conversation about race power and liberation that was happening globally.
Absolutely. His ideas were deeply rooted in the Black Power movement, the anti-colonial struggles happening around the world, and the broader push for social justice and equality. He was constantly absorbing new information, challenging his own assumptions, and trying to synthesize these different strands of thought into a coherent vision for change.
And it's clear that his ideas resonated with people. The Free Huey campaign, his visit to China, the attention he received from scholars and activists, all of this speaks to his influence and the power of his message.
He had a way of articulating the frustrations and aspirations of a generation that was yearning for something more, something better. And even though his life was cut short, his legacy continues to inspire and provoke us.
This deep dive has been eye-opening. I came into this with a certain image of Huey Newton in my mind, the revolutionary icon. But what I've discovered is a much more complex and nuanced individual, a brilliant mind, a flawed human being, and someone who is constantly wrestling with the challenges of his time.
It's a reminder that history is rarely simple. The people who shape our world are often a mix of contradictions and complexities, and it's by engaging with those complexities that we can truly learn from the past and build a more just and equitable future.
I think that's a great place to end this deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground. His early life, the founding of the Black Panther Party, the controversies, his intellectual pursuits, and his tragic death. It's been a journey, to say the least.
It has, and I hope that for our listener, this deep dive has sparked a curiosity to learn more, to dig deeper into Newton's writings, his speeches, and the history of the Black Panther Party.
Because there's always more to uncover, more to understand, and by engaging with the past with all its complexities and contradictions, we can better navigate the present and shape a future that is more equitable and more humane for all.
Well said. And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the life and legacy of Huey P. Newton.
Until next time.